Today we have two stories about individuals who go above and beyond to try to make sure investigators have everything they need to solve a case. However, in both instances, as you will see, the cases take a wild, unexpected turn as a result of what these individuals provide that does solve the case, but in just an extremely unexpected way. But before we get into today's stories, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place because that is all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that is of interest to you, please replace all the water in the like button's ice tray with white vinegar. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of October 20th, 1997, a 40-year-old man named Kevin Dowling rowed a small boat across a reservoir that was near his home in Spring Grove, Pennsylvania. And this reservoir was beautiful. It was quiet and peaceful out here, and the weather was perfectly cool. And the leaves on all the trees around the water were very colorful and starting to fall. And as Kevin looked around at all this incredible scenery, he knew he had chosen the exact right spot for what he needed to do. He gripped the wooden oars tightly with both of his hands, feeling the rough texture of the wood against his palms. He pulled back slowly, feeling the resistance of the deep, dark water against the blades. The boat glided forward smoothly, cutting through the calm surface of the reservoir. Every time he took a stroke, the quiet splash of the water was the only sound that echoed across the vast open area. It was early, and the fog was still rising off the water, creating a dreamlike atmosphere that made Kevin feel entirely isolated from the rest of the busy world. For a man who had spent the last several months in a state of constant, suffocating anxiety, this silence was exactly what he had been searching for. Kevin had rented this boat to go fishing. But in reality, he was out here primarily just to have a place where he could relax and just think. Lately, Kevin's life had been incredibly stressful, and so moments of calm and peace were just very few and far between. The stress really began when recently Kevin had lost his full-time job. He had been an operations manager at a convenience store, and he had been fired after making just one mistake. He had always prided himself on being a perfect, flawless professional, and this sudden termination was a massive blow to his self-esteem. He felt like he had let down his family, and the financial pressure was growing by the day. And now he had to work the night shift at a Staples store just to support his family. And they were barely getting by on his new meager earnings. The long nights spent stocking shelves under harsh fluorescent lights only added to his exhaustion. And Kevin, believe it or not, was generally speaking a very overachieving person. He liked to be in control of every aspect of his life, from the way his household was run to the way he presented himself to the community. And so to have his life playing out the way it was, just very disappointing. And it was also just turning him into a very stressed out, angry person. And he knew that was happening. He had been lashing out at his wife over tiny things, yelling at his kids when they made noise, and he had even gotten into this horrible altercation with an art gallery owner in town. This altercation had been eating away at him for weeks, lingering in his mind like a dark cloud. And so finally, after a couple of months of just being this sort of awful person with these angry outbursts and sleepless nights as a result of all this stress, he knew he had to do something to turn things around. And so he thought this fishing trip was just what he needed to find his center again. Kevin looked towards the front of the boat where there was a video camera set up on a tripod. He had carefully adjusted the metal legs of the tripod so that the camera would remain perfectly level even if the boat rocked gently on the water. Anytime Kevin went out on these fishing expeditions, he would film himself, both to capture the moments he would catch the fish, and also because he just liked, after he had returned from these trips, to just watch the footage all over again in his living room. It sort of brought him back to a time and place out on the water that was just great. You know, he liked fishing. It was peaceful, it was calm, and so he was doing that for this trip as well, even though, right now as he sat there, as serene as things were, he was filled with a whole lot of angst and a lot of stress and anxiety. But he figured, you know what, I am out here. I need to put on a good performance for the camera, be the happiest version of myself I can be, so that when I return to dry land and I show this footage to my family and I refer to it myself, I don't want to see that I was so, upset while I was out here. This is supposed to be my catharsis. This is supposed to be a chance for me to decompress and escape the harsh realities of my life. So basically, he looked at the camera and sort of told himself, okay, smile and enjoy this trip. This is good for your mental health. And so Kevin rowed a bit further into the reservoir and he came to a spot that he thought was good. He pulled in the oars, letting them rest along the sides of the boat, and then he reached over and turned on the camera and sort of waved and said, okay, I am out here about to start. And then he took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill his lungs, and he cast his line into the water. Early the next morning, Kevin was at his kitchen table feeling extremely tired. So, the day before, after he had gone fishing on the reservoir, he had a night shift at Staples. He had driven straight from the reservoir to the store, spent the entire night hauling heavy boxes, and then driven back home in the twilight. And so he did the whole shift. He comes home, he barely sleeps, and now he is back up again. And so he is just totally exhausted eating breakfast with his wife. The kitchen was quiet, save for the sound of forks scraping against plates. And so, while the two of them are just sitting there in silence eating their food, there is this sudden sharp knocking on the front door. And the two of them look at each other like, who would this be? They both didn't know. And so Kevin got up, he walked to the front door, he opened it up, and he was very surprised to see two police officers standing there on his porch. And so Kevin asked them, like, how can I help you? And they told him they were here because of a fight that Kevin had gotten into with that art gallery owner a few months ago. They said that the entire situation had now escalated, and the police needed to get a statement from him. Now, Kevin did not try to deny that he had gotten into a fight with this person. He knew the police already had a record of their past issues, so instead, he just stepped outside to speak to them alone, pulling the front door shut behind him to keep his family out of the conversation. And pretty much the instant he was out there speaking to the cops, it was like his stomach was just in knots. I mean, it just seemed crazy that the day before he was out on the beautiful reservoir going fishing, having this sort of nice time. I mean, his life was so stressful these days, but it is like just yesterday he had finally found some peace. He was so eager to watch back his video of him fishing, like that was just a nice moment in time, a rare nice moment, and now he has got more problems, more stress being piled on, like he couldn't believe it. But Kevin knew like he needed to comply here. Like whatever they needed, he was going to try to give it to them to get them off his back as quickly as possible. And so he just asked one of the officers to please explain a little bit more about what was really going on here because this seemed pretty serious. And one of the officers, he just said, look, I can't give you too many details here. But they told him there had been another altercation at the art gallery yesterday morning. And Kevin was being considered a suspect at this point because he had previously gotten into a fight with this owner. Now for Kevin, obviously this was not good, this was very bad, this was shocking, this is like not good news. But on the other hand, when they said this happened yesterday morning, I mean, Kevin's mind immediately went to his fishing trip. He had been fishing yesterday morning. You know, he was at this reservoir that is at least 45 minutes away from the art gallery. He had receipts from taking that boat out, he had receipts from his fish bait, he even took a video that was likely time-stamped while he was out in the water. And so Kevin tells the officers that, like, I have no idea what happened at the art gallery, but I wasn't involved. Like, whatever happened yesterday, that was not me. I was far away from the city, out on the water, minding my own business. A few seconds later, Kevin had led the officers into his house. He had gone upstairs, grabbed his fishing bag out of his closet, he had rifled through it and grabbed all the receipts and then come back downstairs. And when he did, he saw the officers were speaking to his wife and asking her about his alibi, and she had said yes. Kevin had been fishing, and she had even watched a home video of his trip that he had made because he always made videos of when he went fishing. And so at this point, the officers seemed satisfied, and they took the receipts as well as the videotape that Kevin's wife had mentioned, and they said they would just be in touch if they had any more questions. Over the next few days, Kevin totally forgot about the police stuff. I mean, whatever happened at the art gallery, that had nothing to do with him. That was totally separate. He had given the evidence over, he hadn't heard from the police. So, in his mind, like that is over and done with. He felt a sense of relief wash over him, believing his perfect alibi had completely cleared his name. However, on the evening of October 29th, so a little more than a week after the police had first shown up at his home, Kevin had just finished making dinner and was about to sit down and eat it with his family when the doorbell rang, followed by a series of very loud knocks. And so Kevin, he got up, sort of looked at his wife. They both exchanged a look like, who is this? And then he walked over to the front, and through the window he could see who it was. It was the police again, but this time when he opened the door, they didn't ask politely for him to just make a statement. Instead, one of them immediately stepped forward and slapped a pair of handcuffs on his wrists and said he was under arrest. So the real reason why Kevin's life had been so stressful that really he couldn't get a night's sleep, that he is just constantly anxious, really didn't have to do with the fact that he had lost his job. That was part of it, but really it was the thing that caused his firing that was keeping him up at night. And that was actually his altercation with the art gallery owner a few months earlier. That altercation was actually really serious. It was not just he and this woman getting into a fight. No, Kevin robbed this woman and also assaulted her. He had been desperate for quick cash and he had targeted her gallery thinking it would be an easy mark. But she had fought back, and in the struggle, he had beaten her severely. And then he was subsequently arrested, lost his job because he was arrested, and his entire life began to unravel. And then while he was out on bail, he is staring down this trial date that is looming for these charges he has been arrested for. And he knows there is footage of him, there is witness testimony. Like he is going to lose, he has got no job, like he is going to look like a total pariah in the community. He is embarrassed, he has made this horrible decision, and like his life is already basically wrecked. And it is only going to get worse if this goes to trial. And so, what does he do? Kevin, The perfectionist who always sort of follows through on all the things in his life, to that point, he decides he needs to go back there to the art gallery and finish the job. He needs to get rid of this woman so there won't be a trial, so he won't be found guilty, so his life won't be ruined. And so about a week ago, he did go back to the art gallery. He snuck inside, confronted the owner, and shot and killed her. And then that same day, he goes out on the reservoir and pretends to be out there on this fishing trip. He drove as fast as he could to the bait shop, rented the boat, and got out onto the water. He films himself fishing because that is what he did always do, but really it was just in order to create an alibi that would show he was out on the water even though it was actually in the afternoon. He was not there in the morning. He filmed that video in the afternoon. He claimed it was in the morning. And basically Kevin almost got away with it between the receipts for the boat and the bait, and this video and his wife saying, oh yeah, he was fishing the day before, and Kevin was very innocent when he spoke to police. But what got him caught, actually, was the video itself, the very thing he had created to save himself. When the detectives sat down to review the footage, they noticed something off about the environment. In the video, the position of the sun, which the officers picked up on, didn't make sense for it being the morning. In Pennsylvania in late October, the morning sun is low on the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows. But in Kevin's video, the sun was high in the sky, and the shadows were incredibly short. It looked like the middle of the afternoon. And so they determined that Kevin's video was not shot in the morning. He could have filmed that at any point later in the day, which created a window that morning that he could have gone back to the art gallery and he could have killed that woman, which he did. To confirm their suspicions, the police brought in a forensic expert who specialized in solar positioning. The expert calculated the exact angle of the sun and the length of the shadows on the boat at that specific geographic location. The calculations proved that the footage could only have been recorded in the afternoon. Also, just to add credibility to this theory that Kevin had forged this video, or at least forged the time he had shot it, an expert was able to determine that the timestamps on the video had been tampered with. He had manually changed the camera's internal clock, further clarifying that this was a fake. Kevin was found guilty not only of the robbery and assault charges that he was initially charged with, but also he was found guilty of first-degree murder. The prosecution presented the solar analysis to the jury, and it completely destroyed his defense. He was sentenced to death, and as of April 2026, he is still on death row awaiting execution, all because of the very video he recorded to prove his innocence. Just before 6 p.m. on Sunday, July 12, 1942, a man named Robert Butler stumbled into a bar called the Green Parrot in Harlem, New York, and Robert was already very, very drunk. He had been drinking all afternoon because he had won a bunch of money in a dice game earlier that day, and he had just been celebrating. He had rolled the dice on the street corner, riding a wave of incredible luck, and walked away with a pocket full of cash. And now he was wandering into this bar, the Green Parrot, to keep the party going and keep on drinking. So at this point in 1942, the neighborhood where he was, Harlem, which is a neighborhood within New York City, it really struggled with a very high level of violent crime. The police were constantly dealing with gang activity, robberies, and street fights. And this bar, the Green Parrot, was very popular amongst locals. And so this bar attracted a big crowd, which often became a very rough crowd. And so because of how violent this area was, and because of all this cash that Robert had won earlier in the day, which he had on his person, Robert had decided to bring his gun with him out to the bar. He knew that walking around Harlem with a pocket full of cash made him a prime target for a mugging. Like he was armed as he walked into the Green Parrot, feeling the heavy weight of the revolver in his coat pocket, and he was glad he was because, again, this is like a dangerous spot. But as Robert actually went inside of the Green Parrot, he found that it actually wasn't that crowded that night. Now, it was only about 6 p.m. and it would get much busier, or it usually got much busier later in the night. But at this point, even though he is very drunk, he looked around and he saw there was like maybe 20 people in there. And for Robert, this actually was kind of a good thing because it meant it would be easier for him to get up to the bar and, get served, get more drinks without having to push through a crowd. And so Robert staggered his way over to the bar where the owner, Max Geller, was pouring drinks and helping customers. Max was a hard-working man who had run the establishment for years, and he didn't tolerate any nonsense in his bar. And so Robert, he gets up there and he looks around, and right away he actually recognized a number of people that were there at the bar. They were regulars who frequented the place just like him. And then he saw actually there was one particular regular, this shorter guy, who he knew was really mean and nasty and just super aggressive. He was always starting arguments and making a scene, and Robert clocked him as a guy that he wanted to keep his distance from. And so Robert turned his attention to Max, the owner. And he sort of sloppily waved at him, trying to get his attention, leaning heavily against the wooden bar. And Max, who was still busy preparing drinks for others, he sort of looked up and stared at Robert and kind of, did sort of like a check of him to see how drunk he really was. Max had a policy of cut off when a customer had too much, and Robert was clearly pushing the limit. And then Max served the other people. And then he walked over to Robert with sort of a skeptical look on his face, and he is like, "What can I do for you, Robert?" And Robert, he is like closing one eye, struggling to focus. He is so drunk, he is like, "I want a drink." And Max looked at him and he is like, "No, you are too drunk. I can't serve you." Now at first, Robert was just defensive and was basically like, "Come on, like I am in here all the time. And I have certainly been pretty drunk before and you've served me. I don't understand why this is different." He felt like his status as a regular should grant him some leniency, especially on a night when he had so much money to spend. But Max stuck to his word and he is like, "No, I am not going to serve you. You are too intoxicated." And so slowly, Robert became angrier and angrier and he began saying like, "You are serving everybody else. There are guys here that are more drunk than me. Like, I don't get it. Like, you have to give me a drink." He was raising his voice, attracting the attention of the other patrons in the bar. And at this point, Max, sensing just how upset Robert was and wanting to prevent a fight, he said, "Look, now you are going to just have to leave. Like, I am not going to serve you and you have to leave." And Robert, he went from now just being mad to being humiliated. He is being like humiliated in front of the whole bar with everyone watching him get kicked out. And it was almost like he couldn't help what he did next. It was like rage coursed through his body, amplified by the alcohol, and almost without thinking, Robert drew his gun from his coat pocket, aimed and fired, and he shot Max in the face. Now, instantly, as soon as this shot rang out, the bar is just thrust into absolute chaos. People are screaming. Like 90% of the people in there had no idea this was even happening, let alone that people are shooting each other. They had just heard a loud bang and saw Max fall. It was just chaos. People are screaming, they are running around, knocking over tables and glasses, and Robert, it was like he couldn't even believe what he had just done. The gravity of his action hit him, and he just immediately pocketed and hid his weapon and sort of just backed away from the scene because, again, people aren't even sure who got shot or where the shot came from. People are looking around in panic. He sort of began to blend into the crowd, and then as soon as he could, he just turned and ran out of the bar, disappearing into the dark Harlem streets about a half an hour later, around 6:30 p.m. An investigator with the New York City District Attorney's Office named Louis Pucco hurried down the sidewalk toward the Green Parrot, which at this point was swarming with police officers. Pucco, who had just been called to the scene, really only knew that there had been a shooting at this bar and that the victim had apparently been shot in the face, but was alive, and he was on his way to the hospital. Outside the bar, Pucco could see a bunch of these police officers already interviewing a whole crowd of people who Pucco assumed were witnesses of the shooting, and there were a lot of them standing around under the streetlights. So, Pucco hoped that at least one of them would have something useful to say. And so Pucco just let these officers handle this initial questioning of this group. If he needed to, he would speak to people later, but for now, he just headed inside the bar to see what was going on. And as soon as he stepped inside, another officer came up to Pucco to just give him a quick briefing. He said the bar's owner, Max Geller, was the one who had been shot, and he had been shot in the mouth and that he was alive, but when he was taken off to the hospital, he was unconscious, so nobody could ask him what happened. He was in critical condition and the doctors were fighting to save his life. Then this officer told Pucco that there had been a bunch of customers in the bar during the shooting and that was the crowd outside. Those were the people that the officers were getting statements from. However, this officer told Pucco that so far almost none of the people they were speaking with were cooperating. Pretty much everybody was just saying, "Oh, I don't know what happened," or "I didn't see who shot who." In this neighborhood, people were terrified of being labeled a snitch, and they knew the consequences of talking to the police. It was like they didn't want to tell the police what they actually knew. The only witness so far who had said anything of substance was this very short, very loud regular who even now a half an hour after the shooting was acting extremely agitated and just sort of like loud and very aggressive. It was the same one, the same regular that Robert, when he had first walked in, had noticed and thought, "Boy, I don't want to be around that person." This regular was just screaming that this whole thing was a robbery. That was like all he kept saying. It was a robbery. It was a robbery. He was hysterical, pacing back and forth, but in the eyes of the officers who were around this regular, this short, angry guy, it just sort of seemed like he was traumatized by what he saw. And so he was just repeating the word robber over and over and over again. In part likely because he was drunk, in part maybe because he was traumatized. And it was like a weird response he was having. So it was just sort of heavily discounted what he was saying. They were like, "Okay, maybe it was a robbery, but maybe you are just kind of out of it and don't know what you are talking about." But the officer told Pucco that, they searched the bar. At least they did a cursory search of the bar, and it didn't seem like anything had been taken. The cash register was still full, and Max's personal belongings were untouched, so it really didn't seem like this was a robbery. So again, it just seemed like this guy who was yelling about the robbery basically didn't know what he was talking about. And so at this point, Pucco, on the one hand, he was frustrated by what he was hearing, but also he really wasn't that surprised. He is thinking that, In this area in Harlem at this time, there was a huge distrust of police. I mean, most residents refused to cooperate with authorities, preferring to handle things in the community. And so it was very likely that some of these people who were out here, not just the guy yelling about a robbery, but the other witnesses, it was very likely that at least one of them knew something. I mean, there wasn't that many of them in the bar at the time of this shooting, but it was just unclear if he would ever get any of that information. But Pucco knew he would obviously still have to try to get some information from these people. So after getting this brief from this officer and after sort of walking around the inside of the bar for a second, Pucco headed back outside to try to talk to some of the witnesses himself. But pretty much immediately when he began speaking to these people, he saw that there definitely was like a front being put up. Everyone he approached suddenly had memory loss or had been looking the other way. He just had this sinking feeling that this investigation was pretty much dead before it was even going to get started. Fast forward about a month and Pucco is still hard at work working on this case. Except the case took a turn because the victim, Max Geller, he fell into a coma right after the shooting. And for weeks he had been in a coma and authorities, Pucco included, were hopeful he would wake up and he would be able to give them additional information about what happened, give them anything, because no one by this point had given them any new information. They had basically no evidence. They had nothing but an empty bullet casing and a room full of silent witnesses, but unfortunately Max, without regaining consciousness, just died in his hospital bed. And so now this was not just a shooting investigation that Pucco was in charge of. He was in charge of a homicide investigation with basically no leads because, again, it is like none of the witnesses had given them anything. All they knew is Max got shot and now he is dead. And then the only other sort of substantive thing that had come out of any of their interviews was from that short, angry guy, the regular from the bar, who had just demanded that this was a robbery. And at first pass, they had looked around the bar. It didn't seem like anything had been taken and they had sort of ruled out a robbery. But now, a month later, they had really looked into that angle, and they had confirmed that nothing had been taken from the bar. So this was definitely not a robbery. And so basically, Pucco had nothing. The case was growing colder by the day, and the pressure from his superiors was starting to build. And so at this point, Pucco decided that his best bet here was actually just to basically start over. Just to zoom back out and go back to square one and just see if there was something that they missed in the chaos of that first night. And in fact, Pucco had brought in a new detective, a guy named John Morsey, to help him with this new approach. Morsey was supposed to be this incredibly smart guy who was known for thinking outside the box, something that Pucco felt like they could really use right now. Morsey didn't just look at the facts on paper, he looked at the human element and the environment. And so on this particular day, Pucco had sent Morsey to the Green Parrot to just speak to anybody that was there. Just see if he can learn anything about the shooting from people that are at the bar where this happened. Like right now, just go there and talk to people, see if the atmosphere has shifted now that Max is gone, so off Morsey goes. And Pucco, he stayed at the station, and that day he was going to re-interview all of the patrons who had been at the Green Parrot on the night of the shooting, just to see if maybe he could get some additional information out of them now that a month had passed and the initial fear might have subsided. And so far, that was not the case. Basically, all the interviews were dead ends like they had been the first time. The patrons still maintained they saw nothing, heard nothing, and knew nothing. And so he had somebody in the room with him right now, and the interview had gone nowhere, and he is like, you know what, you can go, all right, on to the next one. And so that person leaves the interview room, and Pucco, he gets up and he walks out into the hallway where all these patrons are sitting on wooden chairs waiting to be interviewed. And as he is, getting ready to just grab the next person to speak to, he sees there are two women who were patrons in the bar who were sitting sort of halfway down the hallway, and they were talking to each other, and they were really not being careful about how loud they were speaking. Like their conversation that they must have thought was private was loud enough that basically everybody in the hallway could hear it if they were paying attention. But the reason it really stood out to Pucco is they weren't speaking English. They were speaking French. Except unbeknownst to these women who likely believed nobody in this hallway spoke French, Pucco did speak French fluently. He had studied it extensively, and he could easily follow their conversation. And he could hear these women were talking about the case. They were saying that, hey, when you go in there to speak to this detective, tell him you don't know anything. Like, don't give him any information, because if we do and we get wrapped up in this case, we are going to get dragged out into the public for being involved in this shooting. And what is going to happen is people are going to know that we were at that bar drinking on that night, and we told our husbands we weren't. They are going to be so mad at us. We gotta be quiet. Don't tell the detective anything, just say you know nothing. It turns out their silence had nothing to do with fear of the killer, but fear of their own husbands finding out they had lied about their whereabouts. And so immediately Puko, he walks over to these two women and he points at one of them and says, "Hey, you are next. Come into the interview room." And he said this in English. And so the women were kind of surprised that they were being tapped to go next, or this woman was surprised. And so she gets up and sort of waves to her friend, and she follows Puko into the interview room. And so as soon as they sat down, Puko in English says to this woman, "So, are you really worried that your husband is going to find out you were at the Green Parrot if you cooperate with me?" And the woman was clearly very surprised by this question, but she just sort of feigned like maybe she didn't fully understand because, she'd been speaking French out there. She doesn't know if Puko knows that she does or doesn't speak English. And so she just sat there in silence and just looked back at him like she didn't really understand what he was asking. Puko stared back at her and then in perfect French asked the same question like, "Are you worried again in French that your husband is going to find out you were at the Green Parrot if you cooperate?" And at this point, the woman knew like the jig was up. Clearly, this detective overheard the conversation they had in the hall. "That is why he has pulled me in here. I am caught red-handed." And the woman just began to break down and cry, burying her face in her hands. And then after a few moments, without Puko even needing to push her to do this, she just started telling the whole story, the weight of the secret finally becoming too much to bear. She explained that her and her friend out in the hallway had been at the Green Parrot on the night of the shooting, and they actually did see who shot Max. She said it was this guy who was wearing a black and white checkered suit. He had gone up to the bar, and then some sort of altercation happened, and he pulled out a gun and he shot Max, and then he quickly ran out of the bar. Now, she told Puko that she didn't know this guy's name, but she definitely recognized him. She said that, she had been to the Green Parrot before the night of the shooting, and she had seen this guy, and she thinks that he is just like a regular at this bar. Like, she would definitely recognize him again if she saw him because of his distinct, flashy style. And so, Puko at this point, he could barely contain his excitement. This was really like the first meaningful lead in the whole case. You have a suspect who apparently is a regular at the bar where the shooting took place, and he dresses in a really distinct way. He wears, flashy clothing. Like, this is a great lead. And so Puko, like, he is thrilled. He thanks this woman. He goes out and he grabs the other woman and he brings her in for questioning. And she would echo the same story as the first woman that, yes, they had been there. They had seen this guy. He was a regular, they thought, and he wore these flashy clothes, specifically that black and white checkered suit on the night of the crime. And so after this, Puko was like, "I got to tell Detective Morsey. I got to fill him in on what I've just learned. This totally changes the case. We finally have a solid physical description of the shooter." And so he ran over to Morsey's office to see if he was back yet from the Green Parrot. But when he went in there, he saw that he wasn't. And so Puko, he is like, "All right, I'll go back to my office and I'll start making a plan for what we are going to do next until Morsey gets back, and then I'll brief him up then." And so Puko, he goes to his office. He starts excitedly making, plans of what they are going to do, how they are going to track down this regular in the checkered suit. And then a moment later, his door bursts open and Morsey comes flying into the room, and he looks totally out of breath like he has rushed to be here to tell Puko something of massive importance. But Puko, he turns, and even though he sees like clearly Morsey has got something to tell me, he doesn't let Morsey talk because Puko, he has got this big news about the French women, and he just starts telling Morsey all about this crazy revelation and how he caught them speaking French and they were there, and we have this suspect now who wears a black and white checkered suit. He tells him everything he knows. And so Morsey, even though he had something big to say himself, he is sitting there listening to Puko go on, and at the end of it he is like, "Man, that is amazing. That is awesome. Great lead, but I'll do you one better. I know the killer's name." It would turn out when police first arrived at the Green Parrot after the shooting, like on day one of this investigation, what they found was basically nothing. They have a victim and they have a bunch of witnesses, but none of the witnesses would cooperate. Like, there were no leads, information, no real evidence. All they had was basically this one short, loud, angry guy who kept talking about a robbery, but they had sort of looked around the bar and it didn't appear like this was a robbery. And so he had been discounted, and everyone's like, well, he is traumatized. He is sort of like this angry guy who is sort of a mess. We are not going to take him seriously. What he is saying doesn't really add up. So he was kind of discounted, but it would turn out they actually just misunderstood this guy. He wasn't saying robbery, but they didn't know that at the time. They thought he was. They ruled him out. Fast forward a month, and Mr. Think Outside the Box Detective Morsey, he goes back to the Green Parrot to see what he can learn. And so Morsey, he is hearing this, and he was told this is what this short guy was saying the first time too. Like, this is not that surprising. But Morsey, he thought outside the box and he figured out what this witness actually meant. The key to doing this was really understanding exactly who this witness was and what the witness was actually capable of knowing. Because this witness, this short angry guy, was actually a literal green parrot that the bar was named after. The parrot was the owner, Max's pet, and he was always there in the bar. He was a regular sitting on his perch near the corner of the room, and the bird was a huge tourist draw because he was kind of really aggressive and could be sort of mean, and people thought it was pretty funny. And critically, this parrot had been trained to recognize the bar's regulars and refer to them by name. So when Morsey went back to the bar and listened to the parrot again, he eventually realized the bird was not saying robber, robber, robbery, robbery, and trying to describe like what had happened. No, instead the bird was saying Robert, the name of the person responsible, the regular who he had seen commit this crime. The bird had witnessed the entire shooting and was screeching the killer's name in his unique bird-like voice, which the human investigators had simply misheard in the initial chaos. And wouldn't you know it, between this new information and what Puco had learned from the two French women at the police station, they put their information together and they discovered that there really had been a regular at the Green Parrot Bar, a guy named Robert Butler, who was a 28-year-old cab driver who had fled to Baltimore right after the shooting occurred. He had packed his bags in a hurry and left the city, hoping to escape the consequences of his sudden, violent outburst. The detectives were able to track Robert down in Baltimore and confront him about the murder of Max Geller. They laid out all the evidence they had gathered, including the eyewitness accounts of his checkered suit and the testimony of the unique witness left behind in the bar. And when they explained how they had figured it all out, Robert just had one thing to say: "I never did like that bird." Robert Butler was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The Green Parrot Bar eventually closed down, leaving behind only the legend of the bird that solved a murder. And as for the actual Green Parrot, nobody knows what happened to him after the bar shuttered its doors. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya!